On the morning of August 27th, 1896, at precisely 2 minutes past 9, 5 British warships opened fire on a wooden palace in Zanzibar. Inside that palace were roughly 3,000 people. Outside, in the harbor, sat the accumulated military technology of the world's most powerful empire. The outcome was never in question. By 9:40, the guns fell silent. The war was over. 38 minutes. 500 Zanzibaris dead or wounded. 1 British sailor injured. That wasn't really a battle. It was something else entirely. A demonstration. A message written in shellfire and delivered to anyone watching from the shores of East Africa. The question isn't how Britain won. The question is what they were really fighting for, and what those 38 minutes meant for the decades that followed. To understand what happened that morning, you need to understand what Zanzibar was, and what Britain wanted it to become. Zanzibar is a small archipelago off the coast of what is now Tanzania. By the late 19th century, it had become one of the most important trading hubs in the Indian Ocean. The islands were famous for their cloves, their strategic harbor, and their position on the shipping routes between British India, East Africa, and Europe. Whoever controlled Zanzibar controlled access to the entire region. For centuries, Zanzibar had been ruled by the sultans from the Omani royal dynasty. They were not symbolic monarchs. They governed, they traded, they maintained their own armies and fleets. They ruled not just the islands, but stretches of the East African mainland as well. But by 1890, the scramble for Africa had reached Zanzibar's shores. That year, Britain and Germany signed a treaty dividing East Africa between them. Germany took the mainland, which would become Tanganyika. Britain took Zanzibar. On paper, Zanzibar became a British protectorate, which sounds like a partnership. In reality, it meant something much more specific. A protectorate was a legal fiction. The local ruler stayed on his throne, the flag still flew, diplomats still arrived and departed, but real powers shifted entirely. Every major decision required British approval. The British Council had veto power over who could become sultan. British officials controlled customs, trade policy, and foreign relations. If you wanted to understand a protectorate, you could think of it as a colonization with better public relations. In 1893, the British installed their chosen man as sultan. His name was Hamad bin Thuwaini. He was considered reliable, compliant, a man who understood the new order and wouldn't challenge it. But 3 years later, on August 25th, 1896, Sultan Hamid died suddenly in his palace. Many suspected poison. Within hours, his cousin Khalid bin Barghash moved. Khalid rushed to the palace and declared himself the new sultan. He gathered his supporters, positioned guards at the gates, and raised his flag over the complex. By evening, he controlled the symbolic center of Zanzibari power. This was not how the system was supposed to work. Under the Protectorate Treaty, any new sultan required British approval. Khalid had seized the throne without asking permission. From Britain's perspective, this was intolerable. From Khalid's perspective, it was necessary. Khalid was 29 years old. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew the British had their own candidate in mind. A man named Hamoud bin Muhammad, someone they considered more manageable. And Khalid knew that if he waited for British approval, he would never sit on that throne. So he moved first. What happened next reveals something about how empires actually function day to day. It wasn't just about formal treaties or diplomatic language. It was about what happened when someone said no. The British consul in Zanzibar, a man named Basil Cave, delivered an ultimatum within hours. Khalid must step down immediately and vacate the palace. If he refused, there would be consequences. Khalid refused. Over the next day and a half, something remarkable happened. Word spread through Zanzibar town that Khalid was standing up to the British, and people responded. Approximately 3,000 Zanzibaris rallied to the palace. 700 soldiers from the Sultan's regular army joined him. Local aristocrats arrived, merchants came, even ordinary citizens, including some who were enslaved and had little obvious reasons to support an Arab sultan, showed up to defend the palace. This wasn't a succession dispute within a royal family, it had become something larger. For many Zanzibaris, Khalid represented a chance to reassert autonomy, to push back against years of creeping British control. His refusal to lower his flag became a symbol. Khalid and his supporters prepared to defend the palace. They had perhaps 20 working cannons, most of them antiques. Some were 17th century bronze pieces that had been diplomatic gifts to earlier sultans. They had a handful of machine guns, and they had one ship, the Royal Yacht Glasgow, which they positioned in the harbor with a few guns mounted on deck. Against this, the British assembled overwhelming force. 2 warships were already in harbor when Hamed died. Within 24 hours, 3 more arrived. 4 warships total. The cruisers St. George and Raccoon. The gunboats Sparrow, Philomel, and Rush. Together they carried modern artillery that could reduce the wooden palace to rubbles in minutes. The British also deployed about 150 Marines and sailors and nearly 1,000 Zanzibari soldiers who served under British command. The message was clear. This would not be a negotiation. Before opening fire, Basil Cave telegraphed London to request authorization. His message was direct. Are we authorized, in the event of all attempts at a peaceful solution, proving useless, to fire on the palace from the men of war? The response from Whitehall came back the next day. It authorized Cave and the naval commander, Admiral Harry Rawson, to adopt whatever measure you may consider necessary to install their chosen sultan. The only caveat: do not, however, attempt to take any action which you're not certain of being able to accomplish successfully. In other words, Britain's government gave its agents permission to use lethal force as long as they were certain to win. On the evening of August 26th, the British delivered a final ultimatum. Khalid had until 9 o'clock the next morning to haul down his flag and leave the palace. If he did not, the warships would open fire. Khalid sent back a message. We have no intention of hauling down our flag, and we do not believe you would open fire on us. Cave's reply was blunt. I have no desire to fire upon the palace, but unless you don't do as you're told. Khalid must have understood the mathematics. 5 modern warships against wooden buildings and antique cannons. But he stayed. Perhaps he believed the British were bluffing. Perhaps he hoped that other foreign powers would intervene, that Germany or France might object to such naked aggression. Perhaps he simply decided that surrender without resistance would be worse than the alternative. We can't know his full reasoning, but we know what he did. He stayed in the palace as night fell, and he waited for the morning. At 9 o'clock on August 27th, the ultimatum expired. At 9:02, Admiral Rawson gave the order. The warships opened fire. Shells tore into palace within seconds. Witnesses reported that within 2 minutes, the wooden structure began to collapse and catch fire. Khalid's defenders tried to return fire. The old cannons boomed, machine guns shattered towards the harbor, but their shots fell uselessly into the water or struck the ground. British shells, by contrast, hit their targets with devastating accuracy. One by one, Khalid's guns were destroyed. The Royal Yacht Glasgow took multiple hits and sank into the harbor mud. Parts of the palace, including the famous ceremonial House of Wonders, crumbled under the barrage. Inside the palace complex were not just fighters, but hundreds of attendants, servants, and household staff. As the building came apart, chaos erupted. Bodies fell beneath burning rubble. The exact toll became impossible to count in the smoke of debris. By approximately 9:40, less than 40 minutes after the first shot, the guns fell silent. The palace flag had been shot down. British officers could see that all resistance had ceased. Admiral Rawson signaled the ceasefire. The shortest war in recorded history was over. Contemporary reports indicate that around 500 Zanzibaris were killed or wounded in the bombardments. The vast majority were palace guards, staff, and civilians caught in the shelling. British forces suffered exactly one casualty, a single petty officer who was injured and later recovered. This lopsided outcome reveals what the event actually was. Not a war in a meaningful sense, a punitive exercise, an execution of a building and everyone inside it, designed to make a political point to anyone watching. Khaled himself did not die in the palace. As soon as the first shell struck, he and a handful of close advisors fled through a back exit. They ran through the streets to German consulates and requested asylum. The German consul, adhering to international law and perhaps enjoying Britain's embarrassment, granted it. British troops surrounded the consulate but could not enter. 1 month later, the Germans smuggled Khaled out of Zanzibar by ship, taking him to German East Africa. He lived in exile. During World War I, when Britain and Germany became enemies, the British finally captured him. They exiled him to, sorry for my pronunciation, the Seychelles, then to St. Helena, the same island where Napoleon had become imprisoned. Only years later was Khaled allowed to return to East Africa, where he lived out his final days quietly in Mombasa. His fate speaks to the personal cost of resisting empire, decades of exile for 38 minutes of defiance. But the reprisals extended far beyond Khaled himself. In early 1997, the British authorities undertook a systematic purge of anyone who had supported the rebellion. At least 13 prominent Arab chiefs and wealthy merchants were arrested. British records show that 6 were fined enormous sums and imprisoned for nearly a year before being released under surveillance. The other 7 were exiled to distant lands, mostly to Oman, and their properties in Zanzibar confiscated. The financial punishment alone was staggering. The total fines imposed on Khaled's supporters amount to approximately 300,000 rupees, equivalent roughly 1.8 million pounds in today's currency. Khaled's own estates were seized by the government. The British also demanded that Zanzibar pay reparations for the cost of the bombardments. This included compensation for the shells fired and for the royal yacht Glasgow that had been sunk. The audacity is worth noting. The Zanzibaris were forced to pay for the ammunition used to destroy their own palace. The message was clear. The British had not just defeated Khaled, they had systematically dismantled the economic and social base of resistance. Anyone who showed disloyalty would lose their wealth, their status, and possibly their freedom. The aristocracy of Zanzibar would owe their position solely to British approval from that point forward. Hamoud ruled for the next 6 years, but everyone understood the reality. He was a figurehead, a British resident, a colonial official guided every significant decision. British officers controlled customs, finances, and trade regulations. The fiction of Zanzibari sovereignty was maintained in diplomatic protocol, but in practice, Britain administered the islands as a colony. One of the first directives under British domination was the formal abolition of slavery. In 1897, slavery was outlawed in Zanzibar by decree of Sultan Hamoud, almost certainly at British insistence. This is where we need to pause and understand how the British used anti-slavery rhetoric as a tool of imperial expansion. Britain had spent decades campaigning publicly against the East African slave trade. Zanzibar had long been a major slave trading center, and dismantling that trade was presented as a humanitarian mission. But this moral stance served 2 very practical purposes for the empire. First, it provided economic justification. By undermining Zanzibar's slave-dependent economy, Britain weakened the Arab ruling class and eased their takeover of legitimate trade. The civilizing stance against slavery became a pretext to impose British economic will while portraying imperialism as benevolence rather than self-interest. Second, it provided moral cover for extreme violence. When the British press reported on the 38-minute bombardments, They framed it as part of a civilizing mission. Contemporary accounts characterized Khalid and his supporters as anti-progress and anti-humanitarian for resisting British reforms. The narrative twisted a violent act of domination into a righteous victory of civilized power. One British observer boasted that the Arabs have been taught a lesson they will not lightly forget. The hypocrisy is stark. Britain claimed to be delivering civilization to Zanzibar while simultaneously blowing up a palace and killing hundreds to enforce compliance. The anti-slavery rhetoric, however genuine it may have been for some individuals, became inseparable from the machinery of imperial control. Under British rule, Zanzibar's economy was reoriented entirely toward imperial interests. British mercantile firms gained privileges in the trade of cloves, coconuts, and ivory. The customs revenues that had once enriched the Sultanate now funded the Protectorate's administration. English began to supplement Arabic and Swahili in schools. British officials made the real decisions, often overriding the Sultan's Arab ministers. The 1896 war marked the definite end of Zanzibar as a sovereign player in regional politics. For decades, this status persisted. Even as nearby territories became formal colonies, Zanzibar remained a protectorate with the Sultan, a distinction that was largely for show. The British also created a society sharply divided along ethnic and class lines. An Arab-led oligarchy operated under British patronage. A significant community of South Asian merchants handled trade and banking, and the African majority, the largest population group, remained largely excluded from political power, working as laborers and in agriculture. These stratifications would have consequences. One unexpected outcome of the British victory involved the Omani Arab community. The Sultanate of Zanzibar had been an offshoot of the Omani royal dynasty. After 1896, as the British exiled Arab leaders and asserted control, some members of Zanzibar's Arab community began migrating back to Oman and the Arabian Gulf. The bombardments and its aftermath initiated a gradual exodus of Omani descended elites from East Africa, reversing a century-long trend. This would overshadow a much larger flight during the Zanzibar Revolution of 1964. Because Zanzibar remained under British control until December 10, 1963, when it finally achieved independence as a constitutional monarchy. But that independence lasted barely a month. In January 1964, African revolutionaries launched an uprising. They overthrew the Sultan, ending more than 2 centuries of Omani Arab rule on the islands. The revolution was driven by many factors, including economic inequality, ethnic tensions, and political exclusion. But the chain of events traced back in part to what the British had done in 1896. By crushing local power structures and entrenching colonial rule, Britain had created deep resentments. By favoring certain groups and excluding others, they had sown lasting divisions. The memory of humiliation, the idea that the British had once massacred Zanzibaris and imposed their sultan at gunpoint, lived on in folk history. That memory added fuel to the revolutionary cause. After the 1964 revolution, Zanzibar merged with mainland Tanganyika to form the nation of Tanzania, which exists today. So what did those 38 minutes actually mean? On one level, the Anglo-Zanzibar War was exactly what it appeared to be, a demonstration of overwhelming force. A message sent by an empire to every other colonized leader in the region that defiance would be crushed instantly and without mercy. But on another level, it revealed something about the limits of that kind of power. The British won their war in 38 minutes. They installed their sultan, they seized property, they exiled resistors, they maintained control over Zanzibar for another 67 years. But they couldn't win legitimacy, they couldn't erase memory, and they couldn't prevent that long reckoning that would eventually come. Khalid's rebellion became part of Zanzibar's national narrative. Later generations reframed him not as a foolish pretender, but as a patriot who stood against impossible odds. The martyrs who died in the palace were remembered as the first casualties in a long struggle for freedom. The shortest war contributed, in its way, to a much longer one. The absurdity of a 38-minute war of 5 warships destroying a wooden palace to settle succession disputes reveals something essential about how empires actually work. They didn't just control territory. They had to constantly demonstrate their willingness to use violence. They had to make examples. They had to answer every challenge, no matter how small, with overwhelming force. Because the entire system depends on the belief that resistance was futile. But belief is fragile, memory is long, and control, no matter how total it appears in the moment, is never permanent. But the British thought a war won in minutes secured a colony forever. And for a time, it did. But empires mistake silence for consent. They mistake survival for submission. Zanzibar did not forget the morning. It carried it forward, through exile, through repression, through decades of imposed order, until history caught up with the violence that created it. The war lasted 38 minutes. Its consequences lasted generations.